Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today on the webinar Education for a Better World, the OECD Learning Framework 2030. My name is Miho Taguma. I'm the project manager of the OECD Education 2030 project. Today, our director Andreas Schreicher is launching our interim report together with two of our key members of our working group, João Costa, State Secretary of Ministry of Education from Portugal, and Yu Hyun Park, founder of DQ Institute from Singapore. So for the procedure, Andreas will first present the OECD Learning Framework 2030, which offers a vision and some underpinning principles for the future of education systems and curriculum. Following this, João will provide insights on how our work has been supporting Portugal's ongoing national curriculum change. And then Yu Hyun will explain how our framework can support a coalition of cross-sectors now trying to develop a digital literacy framework. You will see how our work can be used differently in different contexts, national, local, or cross-sector. At the end of the presentations, we will have time for a question and answer session. So please send your questions to Erik Magnusson, which you will see on the slide under the icon of question, erik.magnusson@oecd.org, at any time during 3 presentations. Now I invite Andreas to share with you some key messages of our interim report. Andreas, please.
Thank you, Mio, and it's really exciting to present to you what is perhaps the most intriguing initiative of the OECD at this moment, where we are working with educators, policymakers, experts around the world to find out how we can educate young people for their own future, rather than for our past. So let me share some of the findings with you here. Education 2030 is about establishing a common language for this, because of course everybody thinks about the future of children in countries, in schools, everywhere, but often what we lack is a clear and consistent framework in which we can articulate the demands of the future and how we translate them into curricula and instructional practice. So the common language is very, very important, and also to create a kind of shared space in which people from different kind of perspectives can analyze and establish what we can teach and how we can learn in this 21st century. So let me introduce sort of the this work in the context of the challenges around us. And obviously, digitalization is the most striking one. Technology is connecting people, schools, countries, continents, but it's also made the world a lot more volatile, complex, ambiguous. Navigating complexity is one of the most fundamental challenges in the digital world. Now, on the one hand, digitalization is incredibly democratizing. Everybody can now participate in social processes, but it's also concentrating power at a rate that we have never seen before, leaving people out of the equation. Digitalization is incredibly particularizing. The smallest voice can be heard anywhere. Through technology, you post something on Twitter and everybody can know about it, but it's also incredibly homogenizing, squashing individuality and cultural uniqueness. Digitalization can be incredibly empowering. In the world in which we live today, you no longer need a great infrastructure, lots of money to do things. You have a great idea and technology can empower you to realize that dream. But technology can also be incredibly disempowering when we just become slaves of our machines. And where we end up on this equation has a lot to do with our cognitive, our social and emotional capabilities. Here are just a few data points on this that we took from our Pisa comparisons. This is the share of 15-year-olds who say they feel bad if they are not connected to the internet, if they are not part of this global world. And you can see on the left side of this, we talk about 8 out of 10 15-year-olds who report that basically technology has become like, breathing for them. This has also changed dramatically over just a very small period of time. Here I show you data from 2012 and 2015. of the time students are online outside school on a typical day. And you can see in some countries that has almost doubled that share of time students spend online. So connectedness has become really, really important for the next generation in ways that we have not been used to this. Technology is also changing the kind of skills that people need to be successful. We've seen a decline in the demand for manual skills, and that's easy to understand because robots are taking over whole factories. But in fact, the steepest decline in the demand for skills is now happening in what we call routine cognitive skills. The kind of things that are easiest to teach, easiest to test, have also become so easy to automate or digitize, to outsource. That's why, memorization, preparing young people just for the world of the past, is no longer helping them to manage in the future. Where you see the biggest rise in the demand for skills is in what we call non-routine analytic skills. This is not your capacity to reproduce what you learn, but to extrapolate from what you know and to use and apply your knowledge creatively in novel situations. But the most interesting thing is the green line here. This is about social skills, the capacity of people to connect, to collaborate, to work with others, who think differently from them. Those capacities have become really, really important to succeed in a modern workplace and life in general. In a way, you can call this a race between technology and education. At least that's what Golden and Katz did in a really interesting book. Before the Industrial Revolution, neither technology nor education mattered much for the vast majority of people. But then came the Industrial Revolution. It moved technology ahead of the capacities of people, and it caused huge amounts of social pain. Today we marvel at the kind of outcomes of the Industrial Revolution, but if you had lived in those times and days, you would badly suffer. But then, we invented public schooling, putting people ahead of technology in the industrial age, and that created generations of prosperity. But if we're honest, since those days, we haven't really seen that much progress. The norms of education, we still educate students in batches of age with a kind of fixed curriculum that is very much framed around content and so on. So that the kind of norms of the industrial age are still very much kind of dominating the way in which we learn and teach today, where today we have the digital revolution. And we have, again, technology racing ahead of the capacities of people. And we are seeing the emergence of the kind of social pain again. The question behind Education 2030 really is, how can we make human capacities, how can we move human capacities again in front, ahead of technology, so that technology becomes an empowering tool for us? And of course, it's not just about technology. There are many other forces as well that are very relevant. So in this first phase, we're focusing on the question on what should we learn? What should we teach? It's the what question. And then the harder question comes next year and beyond, where we actually think about the kind of learning environments that we need to develop those kinds of 21st century skills, instructional processes, the institutions that can support those processes, the people that can enable that kind of learning. So that's the timing of the project that as we have. So today we are presenting to you ideas for a conceptual learning framework that allows us to, step back, explore the bigger picture and also the kind of long-term challenges that are facing education. And then we've also pursued an analysis of the existing curricula and the existing plans for actually advancing curriculum studies. The reason we are doing is to create this shared space that actually countries, stakeholders can actually see how learning is defined and framed in different contexts. And we have interactive framework tools, and on the second part, a quite detailed policy survey on curriculum content mapping. So basically, we also want to make this as scientific as possible a process. Of course, everybody has an idea of what students should learn and how and so on, but how can we actually frame this in a way that it reflects kind of learning progressions, that it reflects, the way in which the brain learns, and most importantly, that it reflects in a systematic way the demands for modern societies. So let me introduce the learning compass, as we call it, in more detail. We basically, at the core of this is a concept of competency. Now, what do we mean by this? Obviously, competency has to do with what you know. And that is about disciplinary knowledge, content knowledge. It's about your capacity to think across the boundaries of scientific disciplines, interdisciplinary knowledge. It's very much about what we call epistemic understanding. Your capacity to think like an historian, to think like a scientist, to think like a philosopher, as opposed to just knowing lots of facts and figures about history, lots of things about biology and chemistry, and so on. That's the knowledge dimension. But knowledge needs to be enabled, and it's often the skills that activate knowledge. The cognitive and metacognitive skills, capacities to do something, social and emotional skills, very important these days. Your capacity to see, read situations, to relate to people who are differently from you, to show resilience, curiosity, courage, leadership. It's also about physical and practical skills. And the most kind of difficult field in competency is the attitudes and values of people. But they are absolutely crucial. They're not a byproduct. Because competency is really about your capacity to mobilize knowledge and skills in a given context, to distinguish what is right and wrong, what is bad and good. I mean, those kinds of judgments come into this to frame competency. And all of this, of course, is for a purpose. And the purpose that the stakeholders involved in this really put at the top is well-being. Future well-being of individuals, but also the well-being of at the collective level, at the society level. It has to do with jobs and income, obviously, but it's also about life satisfaction. I'm going to talk about this in a moment, with health, with the way in which people engage in societies, a civic engagement. It has to do with the environment, lots of dimensions of well-being that really are the outcome of all of this work. And at the center of this is agency. This is basically about empowerment. Learning in the Education 2030 framework is really about empowerment of individuals and communities. Young people need to be innovative, to be responsible, to be aware. They need to have a good sense of what is right and wrong, and also have a good grasp of the limits of their own and of others, of collective action. Now, in the past, it's often been framed as a kind of individual attribute, but what we've actually realized when walking through this, that it's very much a collective kind of attribute. We framed that concept of co-agency. Basically, learning doesn't happen in isolation. It's by, educators recognizing how people learn and how people learn differently, by supporting them, by building strong relationships with teachers, with peers, with families and communities. So that concept of co-agencies is very central to our framework. Now, let's get to just illustrate this concept of agency with some of the data that we had from Pisa. This is, we call it mathematical self-efficacy. It's sort of agency in mathematics, you could also call this. It's your capacity, your trust in your own abilities to overcome problems that seem unsurmountable. And what's so interesting is when you look at this actually on the vertical axis, you have the performance of countries on the PISA test in mathematics. On the horizontal axis, you have that sense of agency, and you can see there's a clear relationship among the two. We don't know what the causal nature of that relationship is, but there's a tendency for countries that are doing well also to have that sense of ownership of learning among young students. Now, you can see Shanghai at the top of the mass scale, but also Shanghai on the top of the kind of self-efficacy scale. And it's not simply a cultural attribute, what we're seeing here, because you can go to the left side of this. You could look at Japan and Korea. Those are countries that are also doing well in math, but students do not show that same sense of ownership, of agency. So this is something that probably somehow can be built, and it's very, very instrumental. I wanted to briefly reflect on the dimension of life satisfaction as well. You can see that actually the degree to which 15-year-olds say they're happy with their lives varies quite a bit across countries. And we have understood what drives those kind of high levels of life satisfaction is basically students who are connected and not connected with technology, but to meet with friends, to be engaged in physical activity. Often, we treat sports as something that is just about, keeping you healthy, but you can actually see this is also a very important attribute of life satisfaction, of engagement, of taking responsibility for yourself and for others. We see actually that life satisfaction is very clearly predicted by perceived teacher support by students and also by good parental support. Now, overall, the picture looks quite good, but you can see in a fair number of countries, there's also a sizable number of young people who do not feel satisfied with their lives. And often that's a result of being anxious with schoolwork, excessive internet use, also one of the variables related to this. So it's worth looking into this. And what you can see here is not simply a reflection of school performance. And you look at the left side, the Dutch and the Mexicans are both students are happy with their life, but the Netherlands is a high-performing education system. Mexico is struggling. And the same is true on the other side of the spectrum, where you have Turkey and Korea, with students not so happy with their life. So we need to look at those dimensions more carefully as an important outcome. But let's drill further down into the framework. I want to take you to the next layer of the framework. We've basically identified 3 groups of competencies that countries and stakeholders see really at the heart of agency. Now, the first has to do with the capacity of people to create something new, to bring into being and formulate something new, to create something that is of intrinsic positive worth. And that's probably the capacity that distinguishes us most from artificial intelligence as we know it today. It's really, your creative, innovative capacity of people. The second competency, class of competence, is also very important in the kind of structurally imbalanced world in which we live. Can young people reconcile diverse interests, diverse perspectives? Can they navigate? Rather than teaching them something, can we enable them to develop that kind of compass and navigation tools to find their own way through this increasingly complex, ambiguous, and kind of more and more kind of complex world? And the third class of competencies is really about, finding your place in the world, taking responsibility, dealing with novelty, change, diversity. Think for yourself, work with others. It's not just about responsibility, it's also about moral and intellectual maturity, being able to reflect on your actions and so on. So those 3 classes of competency is what the people who we work with around the world always came up with at the center of this. And they're not things that, fall from the sky. Actually, we found that they're actually quite systematically developed through processes of anticipation, looking forward, looking out of the box, looking to the next thing that is going to come. Capacity and the willingness of people, anticipation is very much about openness. But openness is not enough. You then need to reflect on this. The ability to take a critical stance when you decide something, to step back from what is known, to question the established wisdom of our times. And then last but not least, again, taking action, putting that into something that we actually do. So that's the framework that is underpinning this. Now, that's basically how we sort of see the bigger picture of this. How do we bring this back to what we teach and how we teach? And that's where the OECD curriculum analysis comes in, and we've identified 5 challenges. The biggest challenge is simply that the world is moving so fast and the way we advance schooling is moving so slow. In fact, the gap between what young people need for tomorrow and what we teach is actually becoming wider in many systems, not narrower. At least that's the perception of many of the stakeholders. Curriculum overload. In a way, our instructional systems have become a mile wide, but just an inch deep, because we are putting more and more stuff into what we teach, because everybody has their own interest. The curriculum often has become hostage of the collective, interests of people. Quality. Ensuring equity and quality is also very important. And then also the last challenge is, it's all easy to talk about. It's really hard to put into practice. And this is where implementation really becomes often the bottleneck. Let's have a sort of look at each of these challenges. Now, the question first is, how do we embed new demands into existing subjects. And the worst service we can do to any curriculum is that we just add a new subject whenever there's a new idea. You know, today it's digital literacy, tomorrow it's environmental literacy, then comes financial literacy. You know, adding those things as core subjects is exactly what has made our curricula so kind of thin. So the question is how we can intelligently frame our kind of subject areas in ways that speak to 21st century skills. And here's some really, really interesting data that I wanted to share with you. We have basically looked at different colors here at different school subjects in existing curricula. And what we have actually studied, to what extent the 2030 knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values that I've talked about are actually embedded in the different subject areas. You can see, for example, communication has a great place in most of the school subjects. There's basically a very large number of content items mapped against this. Problem solving, critical thinking as well. But when you think about resilience, self-regulation, empathy, attributes that are of increasing importance in today's world, are not yet doing a good job in embedding them into the kind of knowledge and skills that are being taught. When you think about this concept of student agency, creative thinking, responsibility, and so on, also there, it's quite moderate. And then how do we enable young people to grow, new competencies, develop competencies themselves? Think about, anticipation, reflection, action. Again, it's quite modest. There's a lot more that we need to do to make those ideas more present in the way in which we teach mathematics, and where we teach science, history, and so on. History, if it's just a matter of, remembering the facts and figures and the names and places, that is not at developing those kinds of competencies. But when history becomes, the subject of understanding different versions of the world and why a society develops a narrative and why a narrative disappears, fades out, those are the kind of questions to do. Science, again, if you can think like a scientist, know what questions are scientifically investigable, distinguish scientific evidence from popular beliefs and so on. Those are the real questions that come into place. And also, when you look at the new demands, you can really see, look how poorly entrepreneurship is faring into this. It's clearly, our current learning environments are not conducive to actually capturing the imagination of young people, giving them ownership, agency to actually develop their own ideas. So there's lots of more work that we can do to embed those kinds of 2030 ideas into the way we teach and how we teach. Curriculum overload, now that's one of the biggest diseases that every teacher will talk to you about, the kind of amounts of stuff that they have to teach that leaves them so little discretion for actually doing this. And, we always have this idea that, to get better mathematics outcomes, I need to teach more mathematics. To get better history outcomes, I need to teach more history. And in a way, when you look at this within a country, that is actually true. Our data show a quite clear relationship between the number of mathematics hours and mathematics outcomes within a country. But when you look at this across countries, it looks like this. The more, time students spend learning in school and out of school, the worse they come out in Pisa. There's actually a negative relationship between the simple volume of teaching math and math outcomes and the volume of teaching science and science outcomes. So how can you reconcile those two messages? Now, within country, there seems to be a positive relationship between volume and outcomes, and across countries, that switches around. Well, the answer is very simple, actually. Learning outcomes are always the product of the quantity of time and the quality of learning. And you can see that actually also very nicely in the PISA data. In blue, you see the hours of learning time at school. In yellow, you can see learning time after school. And you can see, for example, the United Arab Emirates. The students learn for 60 hours. In Finland, it's just about 35 hours now, just a little bit more than half than this. But then when you look at productivity, the learning gains per hour of instruction, it switches around. In Finland, or Germany, or Switzerland, and Japan, or Estonia, and so on, students learn a lot in very little time. In the UAE, students spend a lot of time and learn rather little. So it's not the volume of time that we devote to the subject, it's the way in which students learn and we engage them. And that should make us optimistic that success in education is really about teaching fewer things in greater depth. This is about, an expanding knowledge base that we all face everywhere. And that knowledge base is filled with, so many facets of the world, and it's growing every day. And those facts and figures are always connected with people. I think it's very, very important to highlight here that actually learning always is a kind of social process. And compared to that, the curriculum is such a tiny box. And we're trying to get everything into this little box. But what often happens is at the moment we put things into the school curriculum, these rich and beautiful facets of the world become very shallow shadows of themselves. When you look at young children in kindergarten or in the early grades, they're all enthusiastic about science. Science is about observing the world, playing with it, about experimenting, finding out things, understanding how the world works. And then the older students become, the more they dislike and eventually hate science. Now, because it's become an abstract world of formulas and equations, they can no longer relate to their current and future life. But our response traditionally has been just to put more and more and more and more things into this little box. And we forget actually often what learning really is about the realm of human knowledge, what distinguishes us from technology, about the realm of ethics and judgment, the realm of political and civic life, development of binding social capital, what makes us work with people who are different from us, the realm of creativity, aesthetics and design, or natural and physical health. Those are the dimensions that often gets lost in this kinds of approach. Quality of contents. How do we actually assess what we should teach? What are the design principles? How can we build evidence around them? And there's some lessons that we have taken from this work. The first is to do, with rigor. Success is always about cognitive demand, making things stretching for students. Focus, teaching fewer things at greater depths, giving people good conceptual understanding of a discipline as opposed to filling them up with knowledge. Coherence, understanding learning progressions. And the challenge has always been to remain true to the disciplines. You want to actually give students a really good understanding of the nature of the disciplines, but at the end, you want to achieve that they are good at interdisciplinary learning and to see problems through multiple disciplinary lenses. It's about focusing on areas that have a high transfer value. If we cannot, predict the future, we need to enable students actually to ensure that there's a good kind of capacity of students to transfer knowledge, and that often requires a good theory of action. Success is about authenticity, ensuring that work is thematic, it's problem-based, it's project-based, that knowledge is co-created in conversation between learners with teachers, and also to realize that some things are actually caught, not taught, particularly when we talk about character qualities, social emotional skills. Now we need to sort of design the kind of learning environments that are really important on this. And obviously also to ensure that we embrace students and learners from all kinds of spheres. Ensuring quality and equity. This is a very, very difficult challenge. Having a curriculum framework that works for all. On the one hand, you can see here on this chart in some countries, there's a lot of flexibility where you give teachers and schools a lot of discretion on how to shape learning environments, how to shape the curriculum so that they can actually meet the needs of their individual students. At the same time, you need to balance this with the capacity to actually ensure coherence and equity throughout the system. But they're actually reconcilable goals. What is so interesting in our analysis that some of the countries that are most successful, at least in our learning outcomes surveys, are ones that actually combine a lot of local flexibility with the capacity to actually moderate the conversation at the national level. And we can even see that, when it comes to questions of curriculum design and implementation, the role of principals and teachers is one that is highly related to the learning outcomes. So teachers and principals who become designers of effective learning environments, that includes curricular questions, seem to be really the ones systematically linked to better outcomes. And that brings me to the very last point I really want to make, and that's the hardest part. All of these things are easy to say, really hard to do. And I want to illustrate this with one point. I show you some data from our Thales survey where we surveyed teachers in Britain, and you could see that almost every teacher in Britain said, my role as a teacher is to facilitate students' own inquiry. You could see 86% saying students learn best by finding solutions on their own. And still, 3/4 saying thinking and reasoning is more important than curriculum content. So it looks like, those teachers have already done all the kind of things we just talked about. But if that would be true, you would find, for example, that in Britain, there is very little memorization going on, rehearsal, routine exercise, drill and practice, and so on. You'd find Britain on the bottom of an indicator that looks at memorization because they have this very constructivist view of how teaching and learning should be. But, the bottom place is already given to Switzerland, and then comes Poland, and then comes Germany. In fact, Britain comes right on the top. This tells us that, the teacher's beliefs are often not reflected in what actually happens in the classroom. There's a gap between the idea of teaching and what's actually happening. Had I asked you at the beginning, who comes out on top on rote learning, many stereotypes would say this must be China. But in fact, it's not. China just comes out in the middle, some memorization going on, but actually not that much. And that's true for many of the other Asian countries as well. Japan and Korea also do a lot less in memorization than what people do. Now let's get to the other part of the equation, elaboration, reasoning, deep learning, critical thinking, creativity, the capacity to solve non-routine problems, the kind of things that we associate more with the 2030 framework. And you can actually see in some countries, UK is an example where that is not so prevalent as what teachers would tell you. You have other countries, Shanghai in China is a good example. They are actually doing some memorization, but they're doing also a lot on the kind of creative elaboration strategies. So I think this is the point I really want to make simply is that we need to think much harder about how we can enable and support teachers to actually implement their beliefs, how we can, build better bridges between the intended, implemented, and achieved curriculum. Why do I say this? Why this is important? Some people say memorization is a very important strategy, and it is. But actually, when you look at the type of tasks that you solve well with memorization strategies, you can see that's true for relatively simple problems, but as tasks get more difficult and complex, memorization becomes counterproductive. That's at least what our evidence from the Pisa survey tells you. So yeah, memorization is one important element of a learning strategy, but it doesn't help you to get to the kind of tasks that the new society and economy really value, the capacity of students to solve complex problems and think creatively and critically. And this is exactly where you need those kinds of elaboration strategies. You can see really on the right side, they become the predictor of solving those kinds of complex problems. Students who can think out of the box, who can connect what they know with what they do not know, who can basically master their learning, who have that sense of self-efficacy and agency. But you also see something important on the left side. Actually, if you try to solve, easy problems with these complex elaboration strategies, you're going to be counterproductive as well. So, using complex, collaborative project-based learning environments to teach someone the multiplication tables is going to be a waste of time. So it's the mix of strategies that are going to be important. But what you can see from this is simply, we're at the very beginning. We are framing the what question. A much harder challenge in front of us is really to think about the how question. How do we teach? How do we learn? That's going to be the focus of the next 2 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for sharing the key messages of 2 years of our work. Now, Joao, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure, and I'm very happy to have this opportunity to share what we are doing in Portugal and how we are contributing to this project, but also how this project is being a key contribution to the thinking that and the design of some of the problems we are addressing here in our education system. So I'd like to comment on the Education 2030 project with this look from Portugal and focusing on the challenges we still have in our education system on what we are doing right now, some of the aspects that we are doing right now, and on the contribution by Education 2030 to this design that we are undertaking in Portugal. First thing I'd like to say is that we are proud of what we have achieved in Portugal in these 44 years of democratic school. These are just some numbers of the census from 61 and 2011 and some data from 2016, and we see major progress in many of the data that involves school attendance, preschool attendance, the literacy levels, and this was achieved very quickly, and we are happy about what we have achieved in these 40 years of democratic school, but still we have some major challenges. And one of our major challenges is that retention and early dropout are still very high in Portugal. To give you an idea, almost 1/3 of our students does not conclude higher education in the expected time, so secondary education in expected time. And the reason why we are concerned about this is not because there is a statistic problem, but because this means that there is a wide set of students. 1/3 of our students is not getting the quality learnings that they should have access to, and especially because this is a problem of justice and equity, because poverty is the main predictor of school retention in Portugal. Now, this is a very complex problem because we know that the less favored children are the ones that are more difficult to get their attention in classroom. It's much more difficult to work with those children that do not have stimulus and background at home, and therefore we are proposing a structured response with several measures because complex problems require complex responses. So there is an array of measures, from an investment in preschool to an investment in adult education, because we know that the parents' involvement is a predictor of school success. And I'd like to focus here on 4 of these areas of intervention in Portugal: the student profile, what we're doing in terms of assessment, our essential curriculum, and the autonomy and curriculum flexibility that we are now projecting in our schools. And I will start with the student profile. We have a problem with school retention, we have a problem with success, but we wanted to address the question. This very much relates with Andrea's presentation on the Education 2030, but then what is a successful student? And we created a group, including teachers, to discuss on this question. We launched a national debate on this topic, and we now published and have an official student profile that identifies as areas of competencies, not only knowledge. Students have to be knowledgeable, they have to have content, but also they have to be skilled in a set of other areas of competence like information and communication, reasoning and problem solving, autonomy and personal development, critical and creative thinking, aesthetic and artistic sensitivity, individual and collective well-being and health, among others. Now, this has consequences on how we assess the students, and for this reason we created a new evaluation model, because if we want students that are critical and creative and then cooperative, we cannot assess them only on memory and on content. And for this reason, we are now putting the focus on formative assessment. We are introducing performative assessment even at a national scale, and importantly, on our national assessments in basic education, we are providing schools and families with qualitative feedback, and not just with a grade, because a student is not a grade, a student is a set of learnings. Now, we have a problem very similar to what has been identified by all the countries in the Education 2030 project, which is the curriculum overload problem. And what we are doing is to identify for each subject the core learning, the core set of learning that students have to develop. We decided to work with teacher professional societies, because this is a problem of implementation. It's not just a problem of discussion on what should be there. It's what has to be effective, what works, what no student can be left without learning. And the fact that we are working with the teacher societies also allows us to do the horizontalization of the curriculum, so that different subjects relate to each other. The final aspect I'd like to mention is the project we launched on autonomy and curriculum flexibility. because what we are doing is to let the schools be co-creators of curriculum. This is enhancing and fostering the promotion of active methodologies, of interdisciplinarity in school. And what we're doing is to give schools the 25% of the time for flexible organization in terms of methods, class organization, managing of the time. And the message here is that we are promoting innovation, not as a goal, but as a tool to promote equity. Now, in all these areas that we are working on, the OECD Learning Framework 2030 has been very helpful for several reasons. First, because it has been inspiring. Also, because we think that we can contribute to this learning framework with the Portuguese experience, and especially because with what we are undergoing is a global debate. So the problems we have are problems that all the countries participating in the project share. This is an urgent debate. If we think that there is an equity problem behind all this, the students who are left behind cannot wait. They cannot wait for us to sit and decide, because their problems are urgent problems. But the project has been very, very helpful for us, because we have common concerns. Equity is a common concern. The curriculum overload is a common concern. The exploration of synergies with Pisa, Thales are common concerns. And what we are finding in the 2030 initiative is a group of people that are committed to think ahead and to think of education as the main tool to create a better future. And this is the Portuguese experience so far, and I'm very happy to be able to share it with all of you.
Thank you, João, for sharing the Portuguese real-life experience, which really gives a concrete case of a cooperation, and that really set a real meaning and real context to our work. Now I invite Yu-Hyun to share her experience. Yu-Hyun, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Happy Chinese New Year to all. My name is Yu-Hyun Park from the DQ Institute, which is an international think tank in association with the World Economic Forum and Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, with the mission of improving digital education around the world. It is a great privilege for me as a representative of Digital Literacy Coalition to introduce our new project to develop a standard digital literacy framework in collaboration with the OECD Learning Framework. Globally, there is an urgent need to establish a standard framework for the digital literacy. As Andrea shared, the digital literacy has become a core competency and job skills of individuals in the 21st century, but there is a serious digital skill gap around the world. Andrea just described as a race between the technology and education, whereas nations go through rapid digital transformation across the sectors. The speed of digital education couldn't catch up such a fast growth. The major gap that we observed was a lack of comprehensive framework, common language standards, and assessment metrics on digital literacy competencies, which can be adopted across the nations. Moreover, high-quality digital literacy education resources and tools are not readily available at the global level. Another big issue we observe is a high prevalence of cyber risk worldwide. The recent 2018 DQ Impact report that summarized the state of online safety and digital competency of 8 to 12 years old across 29 countries shows that on average, more than half of our children are exposed to at least one cyber risk, such as cyberbullying, game addiction, online grooming, and online sexual abuse when using online platforms. This situation is even more serious in nations experiencing rapid digital transformation, where children are exposed to 1.3 times higher risk on average. It reveals the global needs for a comprehensive standard framework of digital literacy that includes not only knowledge and practical skills, but also attitudes and values that enables children to cope with challenges and dilemmas in the digital world and take responsibility on their online behaviors and further create new values in the digital economy. So the current digital situation reveals all the more the relevance of the OECD Learning Framework 2030. Currently, there are various versions of digital competency frameworks around the world, such as DQ's Digital Intelligence Framework, Mozilla Web Literacy, UNESCO, as well as European Commission's Digital Skill Framework. All of them have their own strengths and weaknesses, and we believe that it is time for us to develop a standard that can aggregate all this collective wisdom to benefit every child around the world. With this mission, we believe that the OECD Learning Campus serves a great platform to define standard digital literacy framework, as it provides a great structure to make it holistic that can capture social emotional learnings, values, and transformative competencies, which are critical in future readiness, but has been hard to capture through a conventional framework structure. For instance, a set of digital citizenship competencies should be selected that can enable individuals to minimize risk and maximize opportunities of this technology in order to achieve well-being of individuals and society and to create the future we want. Along the line, we as a digital literacy coalitions, including the World Economic Forum, IEEE, and many others across the sectors and regions, is dedicated to empower all individuals with comprehensive digital skills and future readiness. As discussed, we start with developing a standard digital literacy framework together with the OECD Learning Campus. But furthermore, we aim to support nations by providing evidence-based digital education solutions through multi-stakeholders collaborations and keep track of their education and social benefit. As a coalition, we are open to collaborate with like-minded organizations. If you're interested, please feel free to contact us through partnership@digiinstitute.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yu-Yun, for giving another concrete case of our cooperation, and especially in an increasingly important area such as digital literacy. So now we have collected some questions from the general public. Now I invite one of our team members, Lars, to share with you some questions. Lars, could you read out some questions for the presenters, please?
Yes, thank you, Miho. I have one question for Andreas. Could you confirm that the Education 2030 project is not prescribing national curricula?
That's actually easy to answer. The 2030 frameworks doesn't provide no prescription on curriculum. Actually, it provides countries with the opposite, a way to look outwards. It's like a map. You know, a map doesn't tell you where you should go. A map tells you what the possibilities are. It can enable divergent thinking. It shows you other places, other ways of thinking, and so on. That's the idea of the framework, really to broaden our way of thinking about what young people should be learning. And the common language, the second important aspect of the framework, is about to enable that conversation. Curricula are often framed in very specific cultural terms, and it's very hard to translate those curricular experiences into other contexts, and that's the other important feature. So it enables people from country A to understand how experts and teachers in country B teach something very similar. So it's an enabling framework, a platform for sharing knowledge, a kind of common terminology that allows us to share our experiences, but it will not contain any form of prescription because that would be counterproductive.
Thank you very much, Andreas. I have another one for you. What are the main differences between the Education 2030 project and the Pisa assessment framework?
Well, you know, the Pisa assessment framework just looks at some very small slices of the broader 2030 kind of idea. 2030 really is about it takes a very holistic view on what students should be learning. It looks at the cognitive dimension, at social and emotional aspects. It will increasingly look at not only the what question, but the how question. And Pisa basically just looks at some small slices of those. But clearly, the 2030 framework over time will guide the selection of areas that Pisa might look into in the very same way in which the DESECO framework, we had a project on the definition and selection of competencies in the late 90s, beginning 2000s, guided the initial wave of Pisa. So the 2030 framework should provide orientation for future Pisa assessments, but the latter, you know, what we can actually measure and quantify will always remain a rather small slice of the rich picture that emerges from 2030.
Thank you very much. Now I have one for another participant, for Joao Costa. Have students been involved in setting up the student profile, and how?
Yeah, so what we wanted to do with the student profile and with most of the work we are conducting is to have a very participated process. So one of the initiatives that we took was to involve students. So we created an initiative, a national initiative called Student Voice, and we invited the students to meet in their schools, to meet with the Minister of Education, to meet with our team, and to ask some very specific questions about how they learn, what they learn, how they learn best. And this has been very, very productive and very helpful in the design, not only of the student profile, but some other measures that we are implementing regarding autonomy, regarding flexibility. So the voice of students has been really important.
Thank you, Joao. Let me pick up the notion of students. I have another one that is addressed to you. Will students from Portugal contribute to the Education 2030 project?
Yes, so one of the ideas we took to the project was that since the project has this big advantage of involving many partners, so policymakers, experts, teachers, at some point we noticed that the voice of students was missing in the project. So we suggested to the project that students could be included, and we invited some students from Portugal to participate in the project. And now we have a student agency as one of the pillars of this project. And this is really important because the students are helping us decide and to think when we think of this learning framework.
Thank you very much, Joao. Now I have one question for Yuyun. Yuyun, would you please elaborate on the link you mentioned in your presentation between the digital competency and the OECD transformative competencies that include taking responsibility and creating new value?
Sure. Oftentimes, digital competency is considered as a set of practical computational knowledge or job-related skills, such as codings and others. However, as you can see from the cyber pandemic slide, children already are exposed to various cyber risks and various challenges in the digital world. So in order for individuals to be truly future ready in the digital economy, it is critical to have comprehensive, transformative competency that includes attitudes and values beyond knowledge and skills, which is one thing that is really great about the OECD Learning Compass. So that individuals can minimize the harmful effects and maximize opportunities. It starts from individuals to have the digital resilience to cope with the challenge and take responsibility on their online behavior, such as avoiding hatred, bigotry, and violence online, and discern and stop spreading fake news and stop cyberbullying and all these issues. Having critical reasoning and intellectual maturity, as Andrea described, to confront this digital challenge is most important. So without such basis of such transformative competency, children are not equipped to get ready for the digital future. So we hope that it is the starting point for the digital competency to utilize the OECD Learning Framework so that they can create the new values in the digital economy with creativity and entrepreneurship.
Thank you, Yuyun. I have one follow-up question for Andreas. Is there a connection between the Education 2030 project and the Pisa Global Competencies framework?
Yeah, you know, global competency is one very important aspect of the 2030 framework, your capacity to see the world through multiple lenses perspectives, to engage with diversity, to work and live with people who are different from you. Those aspects are what we're trying to measure through our work on global competencies, but they're also a very important dimension of the 2030 framework. In a way, it's a good illustration how you know, the 2030 framework really provides the landscape of the kind of things that countries and experts consider to be important. And then as measurement technology advances, Pisa is picking those things up. And global competency is one illustration where Pisa is trying to broaden the range of competencies that it captures. It's increasingly looking into, global competence, one dimension, social emotional skills, as we can actually define and measure those kinds of concepts. Pisa is increasingly picking them up.
Thank you very much. I have one additional question for João. What are the main lessons you would suggest for other countries on curriculum overload?
Well, I don't think I have lessons to teach, but one thing that we are, first, it's really the most difficult part of what we're doing. It's very easy to agree that there is a problem of curriculum overload. It's very difficult to find consensus and agreement on where to cut, on how to identify what is essential. Now, the experience we're having is that this concept of co-creation, so the involvement, especially of the teachers in this process, is crucial, because this, as Andreas was saying in his presentation, is more about implementation, about effectiveness, than just a random pick of contents like going to the supermarket of content and say, I take this from this shelf and I don't take that one from the other shelf. So this involvement of teachers in the construction of this core curriculum is really crucial for us. But we have to be prepared to know that this is the most difficult part.
Thank you, João. Now, since Andreas was with you in Portugal, maybe Andreas, could you share OECD's perspective on Portuguese ongoing curriculum reform?
Yeah, actually, I was part of a meeting which discussed those, where there were around 900 people from educational practice. And what was absolutely intriguing for me to see and witness is how you can actually get your educational community to become part of the process of developing the education systems. They were talking about the questions we're discussing here, what students should be learning. They were also talking about the enabling environment. How can schools get more discretion, more ownership, more room for maneuver in framing how students should be learning? So I think it's a great example for how you can actually make education everybody's business. I was absolutely fascinated to experience that.
Excellent, thank you. And also, Andreas, if you have any insight or observations on Yuyun's presentation from OECD perspective while she was trying to open for cooperation with us.
Yeah, I think the aspect of digital literacy in the broader sense is going to be a critical determinant for the future success. And I don't think this is primarily, and I think Yuyun did explain that really well, it's not primarily about technological competencies. It's about the capacity of young people to live in a world that is full of information and to actually navigate information, deal with complexity. I think those aspects are going to be increasingly important. The time that we have, to think about issues, to take a reflective stance, to structure knowledge and information is more and more limited. So the capacity of young people who are exposed often at very young ages, and I think the issues around cyber risks that she highlighted, they're very, very real. And we can deal with this in some ways through protecting people, consumer protection and so on, but the more important dimension will really be to enable people to see, through a world in which, fake news, artificial information, all of those things are becoming very dominant, and the capacities of young people to live and thrive in this increasingly complex world is going to be crucially important. It's going to be in a way, we had the digital divide of the past that was about access of technology. That's more or less being solved, almost, even in the poorest countries, you have a larger group of people having smartphones, but actually almost the worst possible combination you can think about is young people who are not well educated and don't have a great education, but have a great smartphone. So in a way, technology is there providing access, but the capacities of people to manage and deal with this world is still very limited. So I think it's going to be a very important, particularly as Education 2030 moves into its second phase, the how question. I think something we have to come back to.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think we are close to the end of our webinar. So thank you very much, Andreas, Joao, and Yuhyun, and also for all of the participants today and for your interest in our project. This webinar has been recorded and will be made available on our Education 2030 website, and the PowerPoints and our interim report called Education 2030 Position Paper and the flyer are all available to download. So please visit our website. And there are some questions still we haven't answered, but we are happy, the team will be happy to answer them. So please do visit our website and send us your questions. And we appreciate all of your contributions today, and please remain open for our next phase, as Andreas said. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mio.
Thank you.
And last.
Bye.